We have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Greg Levine, professor and recent chair of the Department of History of Art at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Levine teaches the art and architecture of Japan, Buddhist visual culture, and eco-art history. His current book project is A Tree and a Buddha, Imagining Arboreal Humanism, a projected trilogy on global Buddhist visual cultures, comprises Long Strange Journey on Modern Zen, Zen Art and Other Predicaments, Buddha Heads, Fragments and Landscapes, and Other Buddhas, White Supremacy, and Buddhist Visual Culture. The recipient of a Guggenheim and other fellowships, he is an editorial board member of Artibus Asiae and the Journal of Art Historiography. Greg was also kind enough to recommend a few titles for us for further reading about the topic that he'll be presenting on today, and these are on the slide if you want to note them. They're also on a blog that he wrote for us, so if you missed these titles and want to find out about them later, you can always find them on our website. We are thrilled to kick off our Saturday University series with Dr. Levine's talk this morning. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me as well. No. Nope? Okay, thank you. Let me get myself settled here. I feel like I just came on to late night TV or something, coming out of the side there. Thank you so much, Jason, for your wonderful introduction. And my deep thanks, obviously, as well to everyone who makes this amazing series happen. It's a distinct honor to be invited to contribute to it. My thanks to Simon and Kayla for getting me organized, getting me on the ground here, and of course to the Gardner Center, which does so very, very much for this museum and for the study of the arts of Asia broadly. I'm really just stunned by the list of events and exhibitions that Jason has just introduced. I really want to come back and join you for them. Let's see if I can make this advance. And I'm looking for the magical device here. Let's see if I get it in the right direction. This is a lecture about sculpture, counterculture, and the forest. Now that's a lot to put together. I'm going to do my best to try and make that fit as vivid as possible, or at least one way to bring them together. And what I want to offer you is a history of a very peculiar statue of Buddha, not ancient, but dating to the late 19th century, and made by a very peculiar group of white male cultural renegades, we might say, who called themselves the San Francisco Bohemian Club. Now, the Bohemian Club is a rather outsized or infamous group that many of us may be aware of already. We're not talking about things taking place with that club today so much as back in the early decades of its existence in the late 19th century. Now, if a modern statue of a Buddha and the Bohemian Club isn't enough to pique your interest, the club's statue was located in the old-growth redwood forest we now know as Muir Woods. And many of you are no doubt familiar with this remarkable forest, and some of you may in fact have seen a photograph of this very statue or heard something about it. For my part, I want to consider this statue in a somewhat peculiar manner, not quite renegade, but somewhat different from what is perhaps the more usual sort of talk about Buddhist art. That is, I will recount this unusual statue's history and then complicate it with different histories. To put it one way, I'm going to tell one story of this statue and then partly untell it or retell it. And by telling and retelling, I think we might be able to connect more deeply and responsibly with the statue's visual presence in its forested place. And by doing so, perhaps we might in turn envision a more inclusive and just future in this forest and beyond. I'm going to try and not read too quickly. There's an awful lot to explore here. But one of my premises is that place matters. geographically, ecologically, socially, politically, and so forth. And equally, that works of visual art themselves matter in place. Places are active, as we all know, in their own varying ways, and each work of art is situated in place in some way, or at least somewhere, even if it is merely the spot where we stand as we envision or daydream a purely mental image without material. And if visual images converge or bind with specific places, they do so in ways that are sometimes harmonious to us, sometimes insignificant, and in some instances, we may feel that the meshing of a place and a work of visual art becomes antagonistic to us, aesthetically, politically, and sometimes in our very bodies. A work of visual art may also upset the order of a particular place and how it governs or shapes our lives. We may encounter places that have been taken over by visual arts as well in acts of resistance, reckoning, and revolution. Works of visual art, then, we say, are contextual. They are situated and tangled up, and this seems particularly and perhaps somewhat bizarrely the case with this particular statue. Now, I've just made a great deal about the sort of premise of place, which turns out to be a bit tricky in this instance because, quite simply, this statue no longer exists. Sorry to report that. There's nothing above ground to look at, and when we do see the statue, we see it in after images, principally historical photographs, such as you've been seeing. You might say the statue's absence is regrettable, and I would agree with you to some extent. At the very least, wouldn't it be a singular experience to encounter this statue in Muir Woods today? That said, I also wonder if the material absence of this statue may in fact grant us an opening to a deeper understanding of its visual form and history and its forested place. This might shift our gaze from its somewhat overdetermined particularity, its sensationalism and spectacle, to think and to feel even the implications of its presence in place. Which of course now leads me to that place, the forest. Imagine sitting in Muir Woods at the foot of a redwood tree, or lume in the language of the Native American Coast Miwok tribe. The base of the tree is bibbed with russet needles, cones, strips of bark, and green branchlets floating down from the canopy above. Sorrel, trillium, fern, and azalea cover the forest floor, each plant adapted for photosynthesis in the dim light, and above them are madrone, bay, and tan oak. Our eyes are drawn upward, of course, along the tree's huge corrugated trunk, through radiating branches towards the canopy and a patchwork sky above. We look until our necks ache, our minds wobble a bit at the scale, biomass, and age. We may hear the rasp of a Steller's jay, a woodpecker's percussion, and their sounds are but a tiny sample of the forest's bioacoustics. We may catch top notes of aromatic phytochemicals, but we won't, unfortunately, directly sense the forest's carbon dioxide level, the flow of phloem and xylem, the forest's bacterial and fungal networks, and so forth and so on. There is so much to sense and make sense of here, perhaps for most of us, too much. The forest is beautiful, intricate, awesome and immeasurable, unseen and confounding. All of that and more. Such acts of forest description, as I've just given you, which are quite common to nature writing, can be very seductive, depending upon the author's perceptions, reactions, memories, and imagination in relation to place, to human and more than human presence. And it depends also on our own sensibilities and interests as readers or as listeners. There are, of course, many languages and narratives occurring, heard, spoken, acted, present, signaled in this forest, be they ecological, indigenous, colonial, environmentalist, religious, artistic, philosophical, and on, and many of these stories and their accompanying languages spoken, and in many cases different from our own, of the more than human. Hear enough of these stories of one sort or another, and you'll learn of pleasure and discovery in the forest, competition and interrelationship, violence and injustice, and care and healing. There are stories in this place that envision different sorts of futures, some of them quite fearful. Those in particular owing to the ecological derangement of our burning planet. But there are also stories that are resilient and just for ourselves and others, stories of the future. Here is one story from the past. It's August 1892, and if you happen to be a member of San Francisco's white, male, quite exclusive Bohemian Club, a banker, let's say, a politician, a railroad baron, a professor at UC Berkeley or Stanford, an artist or musician, you would have opened your mail one morning to find an invitation to the club's summer encampment. Encampment is a term used by the club. That invitation read in part, "In Buddha's great name, you were bidden to the Sermon of the Myriad Leaves, in dedication of Bohemia's Redwood Temple, September 3rd, 1892. The Bohemian Club organized this and other summer encampments in the forest north of San Francisco to allow its members to drop, as they put it, quote, the masks and costumes of the money-getter and become again as nature made them, unquote. For it was among the towering trees that the proper Bohemian could forget that ever man was born to toil. This credo still applies to today's Bohemian Club at its current forest property along the Russian River to the north of Muir Woods. In any case, the term Redwood Temple is quite particularly a product of the colonial imaginary of America's forests as sanctuaries, sacred but not in the terms of institutional religion. The name echoes the poet William Cullen Bryant's exclamation that the groves were God's first temples, and Charles Baudelaire's view that nature is a temple of living pillars. Now, in more practical terms, tickets to the Bohemian Club's summer encampment in 1892 cost members $5, or today about $150. And in preparation, the members packed outdoor clothing, bed linens, a flask with their favorite whiskey perhaps, a book or two, an instrument, a diary, a sketchbook. And then they made the trek from the city, either San Francisco or Berkeley in the East Bay, and Oakland to the Redwood Temple. They did so by taking ferries to Sausalito, either again from San Francisco or from Berkeley. And from Sausalito, they caught the train to Mill Valley, hopped on a carriage that made the climb up to the Marin Ridge, moving towards the Pacific, and then getting grand views across the Pacific Ocean, and then descending into the forest below Mount Tamalpais that is now Muir Woods. And you can kind of see this route a little bit with at least some of the dotted red line in this illustration from 1917. Let's review a bit of the backstory of all that logistics. The Bohemian Club acquired its forest retreat, its Redwood Temple, in 1892 in a transaction that took place downstream from the initial centuries of North American settler colonialism, beginning with the Spanish occupation of Alta California and the displacement and genocide of Native American tribes. Following Mexico's assumption of this territory, the area was parceled off in land grants, including that of the 19,000-acre Rancho Sausalito, comprising a great deal of Mill Valley and Marin County. Rancho Sausalito was later acquired by the Tamalpais Land and Water Company, which eventually, in 1892, sold 80 acres of its forest to the Bohemians. And then it was only in 1908 when land was purchased again and secured to become Muir Woods. Prior to colonization and the sequence of economic transactions, of private property ownership, this forest had been for millennia part of the homeland of the Coast Miwok tribe of Native Americans, whose descendants and communities continue today to live in the Bay Area and elsewhere. As I shall note at the end of this talk, this is a story about the Coast Miwok in relationship to Muir Woods and the area that has begun to return to the forest as a national park. In any case, the Bohemian Club's purchase of this forest was, in a sense, a form of conquest, economic, but also a capture of nature, nature with a capital N, at a time in which few such old-growth forests survived near San Francisco, but also in the general area. Indeed, by 1892, millions of acres of redwood had been completely clear-cut for lumber and for grassland, and deep forests such as we find today in Muir Woods was already endangered at the time the Bohemians were looking for their forest retreat. Now, as campers in this 80 acres, the Bohemians certainly didn't rough it. They had walk-in tents with cots, rather nice latrines. Cooks were brought in from the city. There was china, tablecloths, and candlesticks. There was music, lanterns, and torches for nighttime enjoyment. The staff did the cleanup. And in recent lingo, the Bohemians were glampers. These are some of the most interesting, I think, photographs in addition to the Buddha in the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. Really quite elegant out there alongside the creek that runs through the canyon of Muir Woods. Over the course of a week or so, the Bohemians walked among the redwoods and along the forest creek. They held lectures and readings, gathered around campfires, ate luxuriously, drank and sang, wrote and painted, conversed with friends, all sorts of different pleasant activities, none of which are all that alien to many of us today in our own experiences of camping or visiting, walking, hiking, and so forth in beautiful forests. For the Bohemians, however, the camp experience needed a theme and culminating event, which generally took the form of the theatrical performance based on a Greek or Roman myth, a European folktale, one of Shakespeare's plays, really anything that was romantic, heroic, or exotic. Now, since the 1890s, the Bohemian Club has continued to do this in every summer encampment that it holds today, as some of you know, also is sort of focused on a culminating performance. In 1892, the club, for reasons that I don't entirely understand, decided to go Buddhist for its theme and performance, and it appointed one of its members, the fairly well-known modern sculptor F. Marion Wells, to construct a 30 or 40 or 50, it varies by account, tall statue of a Buddha to preside over the forest camp. Now, just a note here, it took me a long time to try and figure out where the photograph on the left, on your left was photographed, and I believe it was taken from up on the sort of shoulder area or during the construction of the Buddha statue itself, looking down. So I don't think somebody climbed a tree to take this photograph, but this is really perhaps the Buddha's eye view looking across the dining area, across the creek where you can see tents and other facilities, cooking and otherwise. And the photograph on the right here is an approximate view also looking across that creek, not from high up where the Buddha was, but down closer to the creek itself. The statue, as seen again here, was described in a number of different ways by the Bohemian Club, but one name seems to have stuck, and that was the Great White Buddha, which I think was used without any sort of irony in terms of white and whiteness related to race. Instead, I think the white was a choice made in practical terms, given where it was constructed, but where the statue was constructed, but also to have the color of the statue contrast distinctly against the reds and brown, the greens and browns of the forest, and also to reflect sunlight coming down through the canopy, and also lamplight, lantern, torchlight in the dark. You can see the statue here arrayed, sort of placed into and among some of the larger trees, but also approached along a cleared kind of avenue that really cut and flattened the forest floor. And alongside this are a kind of faux rock walls topped with sort of Japanese-style lanterns. Now, the statue itself is rather legible as a seated Buddha. The basic iconography is there, more or less. Though we might agree that its proportions are rather awkward. Even so, the statue was surely a spectacular presence, its height exaggerated by the height of the surrounding trees. On the map here, I'm trying to indicate approximately in the canyon area of Muir Woods, the Redwood Canyon, where the statue was located. And the 80 acres where the Bohemians camped, now called the Bohemian Grove, are an area one passes by if one is taking the west side trail along the creek. As for its construction, the sculptor Marion Wells and his assistants surely had quite a time of it, working outdoors with pine lumber and what appears to be plaster-soaked burlap. These are not the fine materials of traditional Buddhist sculpture, to be sure, and keep in mind that everything had to be hauled from the city. The color white, as I suggested, is that best suited to a kind of contrast with the forest. And then we also see the arrangement of the kind of fake rock walls here. We even see kinds of garlands of what may be kind of laurel branches or some other understory tree created to adorn the kind of altar area that was constructed in front of the statue. And you can see some of the barrels of white plaster on the side here and ladders going up. And again, I think that forest, that dining hall, dining room, dining area view was taken by somebody up on one of those ladders high up on the Buddha itself. Now, just as a side note, the Bohemian Buddha was not the only large-scale Buddha to appear in San Francisco. In 1915, the Panama Pacific Exposition hosted a number of different elaborate architectural structures, all of them temporary, of course, that included the Pavilion for Japan, which was quite spectacular with the placement of this large Buddhist statue on the entrance into Japan's pavilion. This too, like the Bohemian Buddha, was a temporary statue. Both of them are kind of what we would call temporary art installations today, perhaps. But in this case, this was created by Japan in its own self-representation as a nation within the Euro-American imperial context of the world's fairs. And this, of course, no longer survives, as you can well imagine. Now, Marion Wells's Buddha in the forest wasn't strictly a product of his imagination or merely generic. It was modeled specifically after the great bronze Buddha of Kamakura, Japan, the Daibutsu, famous for its exposed outdoor setting and, to Western travelers, its contemplative aura. As the San Francisco Call newspaper put it, in 1891, I believe, 1893, I believe, after the encampment, the Bohemian Buddha was to be the exact counterpart of the Kamakura Buddha. The Kamakura Buddha, of course, sits, quote, drowsily upon his pedestal, the apotheosis of contemplation, the perfect type of perfect philosophical thought, unquote. Now, this was a statue familiar to many of the members of the Bohemian Club, including those who had seen it firsthand as one of the Buddhist wonders of Asia during their tours of Asia in the 1880s. Commercial photographers such as Felice Beato and others produced multiple versions of photographs for the commercial photography market that circulated widely to armchair travelers in the West. The Kamakura statue, having lost its surrounding architecture in the 13th century, was indeed, for a time, probably the most famous statue of a Buddha in the West. It seems a rather simple choice, in fact, to adopt it as the model for the great white Buddha in the forest. Even so, there's something a little bit off about the statue. There's something that slips away from its authentic Japanese Buddhist model, and its jowly jawline, its high ridge of the nose, both seem to depart, shall we say, from Buddha's conventional physiognomic appearance. Rather than sculptural ineptitude, however, I actually think that this is something that the sculptor intended with an ulterior motive, namely a visual conflation of the face of the Buddha with the face of the Bohemian Club's president, George Bromley, who we see in an illustration from 1897 in, again, the San Francisco Call newspaper. I think there's more than a little resemblance here. Now, Wells might have intended this sort of mashup as a visual pun, an inside joke, obviously one that the Bohemian Club members themselves would get because George Bromley was still among them and, in fact, officiated, as we'll see, at the event performed with the statue. But it's also possible that Marion Wells was aware of, or other members of the Bohemian Club, that there are certain Buddhist icons in Asia that do combine the facial features of an imperial ruler with the Buddha to visualize the unity of divine and imperial bodies and the embodiment of Buddhist kingship. In any case, at the very least, the Bohemians were indeed paying attention to Buddhism as it was being introduced to bourgeois and upper-class white Americans during the 19th century. And in San Francisco, there were any number of lectures on Buddhism to which one could attend that were given by Christian missionaries returning from Asia, by American diplomats also coming back from abroad. Newspapers ran multiple articles on the religion of Buddhism, the Buddhist sites of Asia, Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist as heresy, heretical and heathen, and one could certainly stack by one's armchair any number of Asia travel memoirs with descriptions of Buddhist temples, priests, rituals, and explanations of Buddhist philosophy. In 1889, in fact, the Bohemians went straight to the source, you might say, albeit an Orientalist source, when they hosted a lecture in San Francisco on Buddhism by Sir Edwin Arnold, the very famous author of the best-selling biography in English of the Buddha, The Light of Asia, published in 1879. One can imagine then that the Bohemians believed they had a good sense of Buddhism, or at least enough to dream up the Great White Buddha. And today, of course, we recognize this as a very exoticist and Orientalist appropriation of Buddhism, of Buddhist imagery, one that expanded, we might say, and diverged a little bit from the stereotypical Parisian la vie bohème, which was not quite as infatuated with Asia as the Bohemians appear to have been. Now, the Bohemians, in their Redwood temple, didn't just look at their Great White Buddha as a spectacular sort of thing. They engaged it in a ritual performance titled The Sermon of the Myriad Leaves. This refers to the multiple different trees of which the redwood is king. They dressed for this event in fantasies of formal Buddhist clerical robes, in some cases using what appeared to be Japanese cotton kimono, and in others, simply bed sheets. The sermon's officiants, those you see here, meanwhile, wore a mitre-like headgear, which brings to mind, or may bring to mind, the historically later Ku Klux Klan hood. They're not identical. It's really kind of a mashup, it seems, or a bizarre interpretation of multiple religious Christian denomination headgear. Now, Beato's photographs, if we return again to his staged and often very sort of constructed, sort of fictive images of representations of Japan, Japanese people, and Japanese customs and practices, does give us a sense of just how off the Bohemian Club's costumes were. But I think we might want to remember that they probably didn't care so much for absolute authenticity. They wanted just enough to dress up for the right effect. Here again, you can see the kind of altar arrangements, podiums and platforms constructed in front of the seated Buddha, the kind of garlands and the array of different figures who were officiating at this Sermon of the Myriad Leaves. The sermon itself began late on the night of September 3rd, when 200 or so Bohemians gathered by lamp and torchlight at the foot of the Buddha. And it was George Bromley who officiated as the event's high priest. And this is Bromley that you see at the center behind the seated member of the club. Around him were other priests of the leaves and trees arrayed with different podiums. And all of these officiants, of course, are facing the assembly of the remainder of the Bohemian Club members. Now, one photographical note here is that these are photographs that were taken after the September 3rd sermon, the morning after, and you can identify this as being the case because of the direction of the light. And here you can see how morning sunlight coming down from the east is really illuminating the forest as it reflects off the statue. Hence, I think the choice to leave it white. At this time, there was no nighttime photographic technology available to the Bohemians, really. The sermon commenced at the sound of a gong, again late at night in the darkness, and this in turn led to a performance by members of the club of musical selections from the Romantic composer Mendelssohn, I think because Mendelssohn seems to have been very fond of trees. George Bromley then opened a welcoming address. Other members of the officiants spoke generally about the event and their wishes for it, and this was followed by the recitation of very lengthy poems by the priests assembled behind Bromley. The Adjutant General of California, Lucius H. Foote, recited in part the following. This is really just a tiny part of his poem. Convened in the forest and crouched on the sod, we bow to the symbol and worship the god. The smoke of his incense is rising on high. The arch of his temple is spanned by the sky. It is jeweled with stars and cloistered by trees. It is flecked by the moon and fanned by the breeze. Almost sounds Dr. Seussian, unfortunately. Sorry, that's an editorial introduction into the history, which is probably not very fair. His priests at the altars are standing apart. They see with the spirit and hear with the heart. His edicts are wordless, yet fixed and sublime, far wiser than wisdom and older than time. To him, the eternal, sing paeans of praise, incarnate, almighty, all-seeing, unseen, the master, the maker, benign and serene. The voices of nature intone and adore, and with thunder of billows that break on the shore, the worlds in their orbits wheel onward above the fruit of his law and the proof of his love. Here's a bit from Albert Gerberding, who was a very well-heeled banker. Within thy mighty shaft, O redwood tree, a legend like a guarded secret lies. O give it to thy friends whose loving eyes behold the best of nature's work in thee. Awake and breathe the tale of priests who came in treasure-laden ships from India's strand to rear within a fabled eastern land, I think that's Japan, the temple of their fate in Buddha's name. Or it may actually be the Redwood Temple in the forest. Transformed to forest monarchs, mute they dwell. The spirit of the new world wrought the spell that ages after one should find and claim their glories in a greater prophet's name, yet not in vain thy faith, O tree divine, the fairest temple of the world is thine. Now it may also be, as I try to work through this, that the Indian priests who traveled across Central Asia to China, Korea, and Japan, and eventually there were Buddhist missionaries coming from Asia to the West Coast. Those ancient Indian priests were transformed into the trees. There's something going on with that. In any case, these are not crowning moments in American poetry, I would say. But the verses do their best to set the scene, intone the virtues of the forest and the Buddha, and sing of the divine and eternal, of bliss overcoming fear and pain and loss, and a return to primeval nature. And indeed, there are hints, as you've probably picked up, of Ralph Waldo Emerson here and transcendentalism, but the poems also do something quite fictive or counter-historical here in how they try to bring the story of the Buddha and Buddhism to America. They imply, indeed, and this is in evidence in other poems as well, that the Bohemians indeed are the rightful inheritors of Buddhism's history in the New World, and that the Redwood Temple, their Redwood Temple, is even older than the Buddha, and therefore even more important, and more important as a source of this kind of primeval and spiritual transformation. The Buddha, of course, as we know, is famous for attaining awakening beneath the Ficus religiosa, the Bodhi tree. But here in the Bohemian Club's self-congratulatory rhetoric, it is, of course, the redwood that is preeminent among trees, not to mention botanically native to the area. Okay, that's enough of that poetry. I have one more quote to give, however, which pertains to something rather odd that took place following the recitation of all the forest poetry. This was a ritual cremation conducted in front of the Buddha, again, in the darkness, on the platform that you see placed in front of the assembled priests, and you see the individual seated who is holding, indeed, a kind of a torch. Again, this is the morning after, and what was cremated here was not a human corpse, fortunately, I think, but an effigy. And you can see the ash remains in the center rectangular area of the platform of the effigy as it was cremated. This was an effigy of the nemesis figure the Bohemians called Care, with a capital C. Care, a kind of character or figure, in this instance refers to trials and tribulations and burdens. These are specifically the burdens of the modern world experienced by the Bohemians. Care, the Bohemians explained, is the enemy of mankind, the sworn foe of Bohemia, who embodies the malaise-inducing world of capital, bureaucracy, and politics. This is precisely what the Bohemians wish to escape from when they go to the Redwood Temple. And by burning Care in effigy, they burn away symbolically and in a sense, in a sort of multi-sensory manner, the experience of toil and travail that they have experienced as members of the bourgeois and upper class. George Bromley, again as the high priest, recited the kind of culminating statement about this event. He says, or said, "I come here in the forest where trees tell of our littleness in the great creation of the world, to place upon this pyre all our prejudices, our resentments, all our thoughts that are in spirit harmful to men and women." Actually, this is interesting. He does engage a broader community, and all our unpaid bills. For a few hours at least, we shall forgive and forget, and the night shall be filled with music. The night shall be filled with music, I think, is coming from Shakespeare. Now, cremation itself was not unheard of in late 19th century America. Some individuals did, in fact, have themselves cremated, many of them having learned about or seen firsthand Hindu and Buddhist funeral practices in Asia. Did some of the Bohemians themselves leave instruction for their own cremation? I don't know yet. I'm not sure they did, and as far as I know, no Bohemian is cremated in the Bohemian Grove. But it was in the Redwood Temple that one could symbolically cremate a symbolic body to remove all these prejudices, resentments, and harmful thoughts. Now, upon the completion of the cremation, when care had been completely turned to ash, which again we're seeing here the morning after, the Bohemian priests were instructed by Bromley to then adjourn from the event, to walk down the avenue that approaches the Buddha back to the area for dining. And there was held a lavish banquet, which according to the annual annals or records of the club, apparently continued until dawn. Now, hearing this story, I think one is permitted a bit of astonishment. A 30-foot Buddha, Bohemian priest, cremation in the Redwoods, who would think, right? It's sensational, rather grandiose, self-indulgent, with dress-up fun and flowery speeches a la Buddhism, and the nighttime sermon seems quite hallucinatory almost amid the enormous trees, the lamplight or torchlight reflecting off the canopy back down onto the statue, reflecting off the statue onto the faces of those assembled. It's rather tempting to call this a kind of 19th century Buddha rave. But then perhaps one thinks twice, begins to worry about the implications. And indeed, we might ask what claims and assumptions did the Bohemians make with their Buddha and sermon, and who indeed is missing from the story I have just told and from the forest itself. Now, in this regard, we should recognize that the thesis of the Bohemia Buddha in the Redwood Temple was in fact inseparable from its antithesis, to use some kind of big clunky terms, namely the urban landscape of San Francisco and the Bay Area. The Redwood Temple was tied almost inevitably with the temples of commerce, the temples of governance in the area. This is the world of care that the Bohemians despised. The story of the Great White Buddha then finds its counter-story south of the Golden Gate. And here's where I'm going to begin to retell or untell the statue's story. In 1890, San Francisco had a population of 300,000, quickly growing beyond that. The demand for housing, water, food, commodities led to massive development. The hills were carved up, built on, cobbled. Thousands of acres of redwood in the area surrounding the city were logged for construction, and other woods were burned for heating. Smelting and tanning poisoned the soil and water. Sewage flowed into the bay and backed up into the streets. There was dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. Not San Francisco as the golden city on the hill by any means, but in other words, these were the environmental harms and also injustices of modernity. It was also a high city and low city with extreme disparities of class, race, gender, ordered accordingly and geographically into different enclaves across the peninsula, though all of its residents were subject to many of the same excesses of urban development. Now, the city's elites, officials, bankers, lawyers, businessmen, academics, and so forth, sought to remedy these conditions through public works projects, putting in sewer systems that were better, for example, but in particular through the creation of public parks, most famously, of course, Golden Gate Park. For the Bohemians, however nice these parks may have been, they were insufficient to their dreams of a particular sort of natural space. What they sought instead was private nature, forested land away from the stone infrastructure and also the moral infrastructures, you might say, of public parks within the municipality. These were spaces, albeit greening spaces, that only reinforced society's demands and tensions. So the Bohemians wanted more. They wanted the private and pristine. And in a sense, the forests below Mount Tamalpais and to the north of the mountain seemed to be the perfect location, a kind of a Shangri-La before that term was even coined. There, the Bohemians could flee and be shielded from the city and ignore the very systems of extraction and inequality, the pollution, the clamor, the noise, all of which was part and parcel of the very large modern system through which the Bohemians themselves acquired wealth, status, and leisure. Now, I'm not sure we can conclude that their Bohemian forest escape was a kind of an expression of the very stereotyped notion of Buddhist harmony with nature. It'd be nice to say that they were getting back to one with nature in a Buddhist philosophical sense. But in fact, and historically, Buddhist communities were not always as nature-friendly or tree-hugging as we may imagine. Many Buddhist institutions contributed directly to vast economic and environmental impacts, including deforestation. The Bohemians themselves were not monastic forest monks, nor were they first and foremost environmentalists. That all comes a bit later. And certainly they weren't kinds of tree-sitting activists like Julia Butterfly Hill and those who have followed her and other early protesters to logging. To the contrary, the Bohemians were forest property owners who sought a place of arboreal experience for themselves on their own personal terms. And although Bohemians were quite well informed about botany and ecology, a number of their members were zoologists and botanists at UC Berkeley, Stanford, and the California Academy of Sciences. What they craved instead was nature with a capital N that offered the sort of beauty that could foster the vital psychic energy that would transform and heal those who were suffering in the toils of the modern world. Bohemian nature in the Redwood Temple, then, was a kind of Buddho-transcendentalist nature, and the giant redwoods, rooted in ancient mythic time, pushed away modern time, industrialized, commercial, administrative, and also, of course, the pollution and noise and disease of the city, allowing the Bohemians, in turn, opportunities for spiritual and physical restoration. To put it in present-day terms, the Bohemians' forest tract was a private retreat for white male relaxation, cultivation, and what we would now call forest bathing. Now, this is also to say, kind of as a footnote, that the Bohemians were not, unlike others, more truly countercultural folks, utopian socialists, for example, akin William Morris and other members of the arts and crafts movement. Their countercultural Buddha was hardly a statement of radical resistance against capitalism, inequality, and suffering. It was a trapping of white male space free of women and people of color. Indeed, the Redwood Temple, epitomizing Bohemian nature, was a place apart from the city's racialized inequality and segregation, and at times, the brutality and bloodshed of racist violence. In late 19th century San Francisco, the city was home not only to those who had gotten rich off the gold rush, the railroads, big agriculture, manufacturing, and commerce, but also immigrant Asian communities, emancipated black slaves, as well as recent European immigrants, many of them refugees, most of whom lived and worked in the flatlands of the congested, fetid city. Moreover, by the late 19th century, the Bohemians were quite aware that the city was witnessing the protests of women demanding suffrage and solidarity with women across the nation. But at this time in particular, there was a period of acute racial tension in San Francisco, arising from the so-called Chinese question and the mob actions led by the labor agitator and thug Dennis Kearney. In this regard, we should not ignore the fact that members of the Bohemian Club, among them San Francisco's mayor James Phelan, were directly implicated in anti-Chinese social repression, violence, and economic oppression. And it was none other than the Bohemian Club member John H. Bolt who pushed through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Bohemian nature, thus distanced from the city, offered not only relief from the workaday stress and pollution of modernity, it became a buffering zone from the social and political realities of race, class, and gender conflict. It was a place that was construed to be independent from politics, to be apolitical, and to essentially wall off with the large trees the rights and well-being being of others. In the forest, one could focus instead on oneself, one's preservation, one's spiritual attainment, even immortality, not unlike today's Silicon Valley CEO on their private islands and expansive ranches. The racialized space of San Francisco was also, as many of us know, a landscape of diaspora religion, not just from Asia, but around the world. There were many different denominations, not just Christian, in the city, and this included the religious spaces and practices of Chinese immigrant communities, whose neighborhood temples, or in Anglo-colloquialism, their joss houses, were vital nodes of the Chinatown enclave. Bohemian Club members were frequent Chinatown tourists, soaking up its exotic language, food, festivals, imported ceramics, and perhaps opium as well. And they did so, of course, as tourists from a very privileged position in the city's racial hierarchy. These are two wonderful images of one of the most famous of Chinatown's temples, the Kunmyong-myu. First, on one side on the left here, this is by the Bohemian Club member Ernest Peixoto himself, who sketched many different scenes in Chinatown. And then we see a later, early 20th century photograph of the same temple looking down Spofford Alley, and you can still wander that alley today. What the Bohemians saw of Chinatown's temples, however, did not provide them the model they sought for their Great White Buddha or Redwood Temple. In fact, what they encountered there was not so much Buddhist, but syncretic spaces that drew from Buddhist, Taoist, imperial, and Confucian cosmologies, local legends, and protective deities common to South China. Such temples were regularly condemned in the white press and by Christian clergy as dark and uncanny, horrifying in their false rites performed before demonic images, and further evidence of Chinatown's iniquity. The Bohemians instead turned to the Buddhism of Japan and the spectacular sites of Buddhist temples and icons, this in turn being a very selective appropriation of Asia and of Buddhism. Now that in itself was hardly unique in North America and Europe, in which Japan was viewed very much as a model Asian nation that had done a better job supposedly of modernizing while preserving its traditional culture. That's a very complex topic, perhaps to pick up later. Here we see some interesting representations. One, a photograph of a temple's actual altar installment, and this does not ring Buddhist in any real sense that we can recognize today. And then on the left is the sort of illustration in the white press from Harper's Weekly that seeks to create the kind of the ambiance of heathen worship, a kind of demonic space of otherness. That the Bohemian Club itself played directly with anti-Chinese xenophobia is suggested by this illustrated prepared by the club member Theodore Wars, who's a fairly famous painter, to commemorate George Bromley's appointment as Consul General of China by President James Garfield. The highlight of Bromley's farewell party before he went off to China was a play which forecasted the reception that he would receive upon his arrival in the Chinese Empire. To visualize this reception, Wars depicted Bromley dressed as a Chinese god before which incense burns, and we see two Chinese men venerating, one bowing and one prostrating. Dressing up as an Asian deity, dressing Bromley up as an Asian deity for a kind of farewell party might seem like just good fun among friends, but I think the racist and imperialist assumptions of this image are rather transparent. Wars' illustration, however, also suggests that the face of the Great White Buddha, completed almost a decade later than this illustration, may indeed have been a double portrait, a conflated portrait. And here we see, of course, Bromley's face inset into Ward's representation of a Chinese deity. So I think that the double portrait Buddha may have something to it. Again, Bromley being the other, the doppelganger, if you will, of the Buddha. Okay, let me move to try and consolidate this a little bit. If San Francisco was the antithesis of the Redwood Temple, we might also recognize that the Bohemians' claiming of the forested canyon north of the city did not mean that they tread lightly or that they left no trace. Like countless earlier instances of colonial terraforming, the Bohemians were intent on altering the forest for their use, their camping and its extraction of leisure and spiritual therapy. And doing so, they set in place infrastructure that we continue to utilize today, notably the switchback road we drive down to reach the valley from the Muir Ridge, which we see here. This is a photograph I was trying to take as my wife was driving us down the switchback road that descends to Muir Woods, which some of you no doubt have taken. This road stands out as something rather astounding in terms of this terraforming project. The club had this road constructed at great cost, probably about $7,000 in 1892 or $250,000 today, in order to ease its members down from the Marin Ridge deep into the canyon, having come up again from the Sausalito side. What's really interesting is there seems to be evidence that the grueling work of cutting the roadbed, and this is really quite a tortuous road, was done by Chinese immigrants. And it was their labor that actually created the access down into the Redwood Temple. In other words, the road to the Redwood Temple may have been built by some of the very people excluded from the Bohemian Club and the forest. In the valley itself, the club cleared wagon roads to bring in all of this stuff for camping along the east side of the creek. They built various walking trails. They packed down areas of the forest floor for tents, dining tables, and for the Buddha. And in the process, they created a system of access for future day tripping and camping that continued across the subsequent decades. The question we now face is how to come to terms with these different but simultaneous places and histories of San Francisco and the Redwood Forest below Mount Tamalpais, and their configurations quite different of race, class, gender, and religion, their different lived realities and inequalities, which were in fact quite entangled, I think. Now, perhaps you find this, or my colliding of these stories, a bit heavy-handed, and perhaps that's true. You may complain that my retrospective standpoint is really a too easy sort of critical hindsight. I hear you, and I've taken a rather tricky path in this lecture. But it is fair, I think, to at least sympathize in a general way with the Bohemian spiritual and therapeutic desires. Our own visits to Muir Woods today may be for similar reasons, and we may find our own well-being enhanced by the forest. And we will rightly rejoice at this forest preservation, its passage from private ownership to the nation in 1908 and establishment as a national monument by Theodore Roosevelt. That being said, the tantalizing spectacle, the bizarreness of the Great White Buddha in the Redwood Temple may claim too much of our attention and may deserve a bit more context. The forest, as I've already suggested, deserves other stories. What I've not wished to do in this lecture really is to dismantle the importance of the Bohemia Buddha from history, to erase it through condemnation. Quite to the contrary, I believe the statue is significant to the history of Buddhist images as they encountered modernity and global translation. I also think the meanings and values it embodied for the Bohemians, especially in relation to modern romantic and transcendentalist nature, deserve recognition, though not without a moral compass. I therefore believe we must do more with the statue in its place, and part of this is the act of converging the Buddha with other stories and visual representations. This is so we don't get stuck in the Bohemian Club's self-indulgence and rhetoric, so we don't blithely end our looking and thinking at the point of the aesthetic and spiritual realization, the forest bathing with the Buddhist statue and the ancient trees. What we need, I think, also is to bring this story up to the more recent past, to the more recent history. And in conclusion, I hope, in August 2021, more than a century after the Great White Buddha, Muir Woods filled up with thousands of visitors who breathed in the clean air and dreamt of a post-pandemic future. Arriving at the forest and walking along its pathways, they encountered something a bit radical, or perhaps as radical as can be expected within the administration of Muir Woods as a national park. For in fact, a group of rangers, the younger rangers, I would say, at Muir Woods decided to provoke conversation about the history of the park and forest that had heretofore been limited, if not at times outright silenced. This is a conversation about colonial history and the exclusion of communities of color, including people of the Coast Miwok tribe, whose members continue to live in the Bay Area. This effort was enacted through a low-tech project of sign bombing, which began at Muir Woods Founders Grove, so named for the Congressmen William Kent, Gifford Pinchot, head of the U.S. Forest Service, and others such as Roosevelt and John Muir. Visitors came across these sorts of official park signs affixed with an ad hoc manifesto and a timeline of post-it interventions, and all of which was apparently garlanded with these strips of construction tape. Here we read, "History under construction," or perhaps reconstruction, and everything on this sign is true, but incomplete. Using the prosaic yellow post-it as a kind of visceral prompt, the official park history was overlaid with counter-stories that interrupt the long celebration of white, predominantly male founders and benefactors. These new histories and stories counterbalance the claims of settler colonialism and white environmentalism, the tidy story of who saved the Redwoods. This saving the Redwoods and its white benefactors is a notion that drips with irony given the fact that it was settler colonial expansion that all but logged the Redwoods out of existence. In any case, as we look at these post-its, and just a kind of a note here, what we see here is actually one of the formal permanent signs that developed from the ad hoc post-its. And here you can see them just simply stuck onto the sign. What we see is a timeline that recognizes Indigenous Americans, the forest as native homeland, a place of indigenous ancestors and kin, food, medicine, materials, dreams, and stories. And there are new descriptions that call out white supremacy, including the active support for eugenics on many of the white environmentalists. And there are new dates that emphasize the role of women in the campaign to protect the forest. Notably, this reconstruction of history also presents the forest before it became a trophy of colonization and private ownership, a forest whose meanings and values precede the park's function as a kind of gateway experience for redwood tourism. This is usually the first redwood park that most of us visit because of its proximity to San Francisco. Instead of being a gateway experience, it is now a kind of ancient native space, native homeland, now very much closely connected to the present federated Indians of the Grayton Rancheria to the north near Santa Rosa. The Federation had long fought and very hard fought to receive federal tribal recognition and legal rights. History under construction, then, is therefore a small decolonizing action that affirms the fact that Muir Woods, as well as the Bohemian Club's encampment and Great White Buddha, constitute but brief moments in native time and native place. To encounter this ad hoc intervention, which is now, as I noted, become more formal in the signage, is to reckon with and realize other histories. It puts the visitor in a position to begin to hear these stories with respect, I hope, and then by learning from them, envision and work towards futures for the forest that are more inclusive in lived and material ways, and which can better be, and through which we can better contend with the now threatened survival of the giant redwoods in their ecological homeland. Part of this forest's future well-being, in fact, and our own well-being, we might say, will now probably depend in part on Native American ecocultural fire practices, of regular cultural burning to reduce understory fuel as a very important tool for protecting this and other forests from the extreme and catastrophic fires we're now living through. I would like to think then that this historical resituation of the Bohemian Club's peculiar Great White Buddha into the late 19th century urban social history of San Francisco, and then into more recent reckoning with colonialism, does not amount to a dismissal of the statue and its significance to Buddhist visual cultures and modern Buddhism. I don't believe that the Bohemian Buddha should be demonized, but I also don't think it should be too easily recuperated. I don't think that it should be left alone in its historical moment and place. To continue to isolate the Buddha is to refuse surrounding histories and lived realities. Situated in a denser historical and visual context, then, the Great White Buddha, with its exoticism and excess, may perhaps help us to deepen our recognition of how visual images, sometimes Buddhist Orientalist, but indeed any visual image, can elevate some of us, but also capture, control, and exclude others, both human and more than human. And in a period in which we have witnessed monuments around the world being removed in reckoning with white supremacism and colonialism, The absence today of the great white Buddha statue in the forest does strike me as an opening towards understandings of the past and more inclusive ways forward to a more just future. The old-growth redwood forest of Muir Woods is, I like to think, a place in which we can engage these questions, challenges, and dreams, even in response to a peculiar Orientalist statue of a Buddha. Thank you. Wonderful. I see hands going up very quickly. Can you hear me with the microphone? Let's see. To the fourth row there, and there will be a mic journeying to you, I think, here. Let's see. Raise your hand again for the mic, I guess.
How long was the statue up for?
How long did it survive?
Yeah.
It was probably more or less dilapidated or partly demolished by the teens, the 19-teens. So it probably lasted only for about a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades. There are newspaper articles from the 1890s, late 1890s, talking about how tourists can day trip up to the forest and they can sort of jump on top of the Buddha and throw pine cones at it and so forth. Yes, down in the front here.
Well, aside from the visual pun with the club president, why does he look so grumpy, the Buddha?
Yeah, it does not seem serene. It does not seem to have the kind of contemplative poise, equanimity of the Kamakura great bronze Buddha and other statues. I think it's partly the conflation of getting Bromley's face in there, but I think, again, what the construction involved is building that pine wood lathed kind of under skeleton and then taking burlap fabric and putting like plaster on it. It's very hard to sculpt and shape, I would think. So I have a feeling there was a bit of limitation on how exquisite or elegant the statue could be. I think, you know, as we look at the robes coming down, there are a few nice moments there, but generally it's very, very kind of awkward. So I think I wouldn't want to try and have to make a statue of that size with those materials and have it come out with a kind of a beautiful, resonant kind of appearance. Thank you.
You mentioned that it was common for the members to bring diaries. And do we have in the historical record, like the sense that they were making, the participants, you know, in the audience? Do we know anything about what they wrote?
Yes, we do. So one of my primary sources is the published 1900 Annals of the Bohemian Club. There are a number of diaries of very prominent members, but none of them are published, and they're not digitized. So a little bit of legwork in the future will be going off to different collections around the country, many of them in the East Coast, in fact, to try and see if there are more intimate, more particular descriptions going on. Because I think we need that to either counter the story I have given and tried to counter with more of the firsthand accounts. There are a number of newspaper articles that were coming out simultaneously in the San Francisco News Call that I've also used here. So there was reporting about this statue even as it was being constructed, and then in sort of during the encampment, and then for years after. So that's my other primary source. And maybe some will have been digitized by the time I get back to poking around. Thank you. Let's see, I think there was a hand way in the back. Or a couple hands back there.
Hi, Greg. It's Ping. Welcome
Ping.
to Seattle.
Thank you.
My question, I have a two-parter. The first question is, I think you made it very clear that there were no women in attendance at this event. I except when you mentioned this quotation from George Brumley that the blessings garnered from the event were designed to benefit both men and women, I would say that that would be a small chink in this armor. My first question is, what did the wives of all these guys think about what they were doing in the woods? And whether there were any indication of their opinions that are left to us. My second question is regarding, and I've been thinking about this quite a bit in recent years, about anonymous makers who actually built this thing. And you earlier also mentioned that the roads were created by Chinese workers, as many of these large construction projects at this time were. So I wonder who were the people who built the structures, who applied the burlap, and we know the name of the artist, but what is the likelihood that the actual people who put hands on this Buddha were actually provided by immigrant labor?
Yeah, excellent question. So again, it's the archival deeper dive that would help us, I think, engage those questions. So there are very prominent, thank you, very prominent women within this level of San Francisco society, and many of them were very active over the next few years in campaigning to preserve the forests themselves. But also very active in all sorts of other social civic efforts. There were also very prominent botanists who were women at the California Academy of Science, and so there's a whole kind of world, whether it is environmentalist or scientific, or also literary and visual, that is excluded from the world of the Bohemian Club. So the diaries and the letters of their partners, their families, and so forth would be important to explore. And the same is true with indications of how the infrastructure, how the service industry, so to speak, was provided for the glamping experience. As you dig deeper into the Bancroft Library Photographic Archive, there are a range of other photographs that seem a bit more snapshots of how the camp was set up and who was there to do the work. And we do see, I believe, Latino workers. There were no women at the camp. But I think the other place to turn, which is a sort of different matter, is the archive of the Bohemian Club itself, which is very difficult to get access to, and I've not been able to show you any of the materials that I saw and was able to photograph for research purposes. I would be violating all sorts of rules were I to show them. But I think in that archive as well, we'll get more of an understanding of how both there were people of color, there were women who were present in the club. Women, even today with the Bohemian Club, are regularly part of the events there, but they are not members, and they're excluded from a lot of the main primary events. So I think that there's a whole picture of alterity, of otherness, and of exclusion that we can explore, but also seek to revive the stories of the other cultures, the other peoples, and other communities that were also living an active, whether it was in terms of religious practice or environmentalism or creative visual and spiritual pursuits around this club. I don't remember the name, but there was another club that was formed in San Francisco around this time, and these were all social clubs. These were very elite kinds of clubs that one found across the nation, especially in New York City, the Century Club and so forth, and that exists today. But in San Francisco, there was another club whose name escapes me that was specifically organized by women to be multigender, and I'd love to go back and learn more about that particular group, because it wasn't the case that everything was so rigidly segregated. There were real renegades and radicals in San Francisco, socialist, anarchist, or otherwise at this time. And another group, just to add this on another group that is really excluded from this, were members of Japanese Buddhist communities, Japanese Buddhist missionaries coming, in fact, to San Francisco from the 1890s, a little bit later than 1892, if I recall, who were meeting with city officials, who were also meeting with congregations of Japanese immigrants as well. So in other words, there's a vast landscape that we can really try to explore to, again, de-essentialize, to not simply focus all of our interest and excitement or amusement on the Bohemian Club. Very long-winded. I hope it got at some of your questions.
Did Buddhism continue to be a motif in the annual retreat year after year after year? That is, was this sort of nature, return to nature, all framed in a Buddhist idiom?
Thank you, James. This is one of my college professors and mentors, and it's such a joy to get a question from James. I was really hoping that I would see that Buddhism really kept going for the Bohemians. And what you can do, and these are published, there are lists of all the theatrical performances that they had year by year by year. I think they started keeping these a little bit later, but you can see all the themes. Who was the person who conceived the idea, who was the producer, who was the officiant, and so forth. There's very little that's Buddhist. There's some Hindu themes. There are sort of ancient religions and sort of mythic Zoroastrianism and so forth. But Buddhism doesn't really continue and sustain, unfortunately, because I was really hoping that they would do other fantastic kinds of Buddhistic or Buddhist-y kinds of things. But I was also very interested to see if there were also continuations of this Buddho-transcendentalist, this kind of very modern spiritual kind of formulation, which is distinctly of its own sort, and really forces us to think about how spirituality related to Buddhism and other religions was developing in this period. So not to simply condemn it as inauthentic, but to see how people were deeply trying to understand modernity at this time, and whether it was within the spaces of labor or the spaces of finance. The harms and damages were very, very deeply felt. And in the context of diaspora communities, of course, there were ongoing struggles against racism and xenophobic attacks upon religious practice. So I really wish to see if the Bohemians were engaging Buddhism, and in a wider sense, how religion itself, modern religion itself, figured through the 19th and early 20th century. And today, religion is not really kind of brought into the Bohemian Club directly. It's like, having been to one Bohemian Club event in San Francisco, it's clear you do not mention anything about your career, your profession, or work, because that's all about that horrible condition of care. In the same way, I don't think religion is really brought in to a lot of the Bohemian Club's conversations. But religion as culture, as myth, is, I think, a different matter. And that, I think, continues to the present. Let's see. Yeah, on here.
So I really liked your framing of tellings and retellings, and then recognizing that there's things we can appreciate about this, but also we should be critical, and there's maybe not an easy way to resolve that. I wondered specifically around the notion of expropriation and cultural appropriation. It seems that there's aspects of Buddhism that would be against that, or that would want to be propagated, like successful religion, successful cultural memes. They want to be reproduced, even if imperfectly. So I wonder if you could talk about just the notion of expropriation in Buddhism, and maybe how they think about it, maybe how it gets expressed differently through time.
Thank you. That's a great question, and that's a huge one. In an earlier version of this PowerPoint, I had a slide of one of the big Buddhist statues that you find in the Buddha bars that popped up around the world, which are basically Asian fusion restaurants with electronica music played, and very nice kind of dining experience with a very, very large sort of golden statue of a Buddha. Usually there's a DJ, setting stuff up in front of it. In one article back years ago, there were all sorts of protests reported against these Buddha bars by practicing faith-based Buddhist communities. But one interview of a Thai Buddhist monk led to an interesting point about how, well, this looks like a statue of a Buddha, but it is not a Buddha because it has not been consecrated. It is not a religious image or icon. It has not undergone the transformation from mere material into the deity itself, which is a logic or a conception, an ontology, an understanding of presence that is particular to religious iconic images. So the Thai master, the monk, was basically saying, I don't care about the Buddha bars because it's just material, it's just stuff. Yes, it's commercial, and yes, it may not be entirely respectful, because there is alcohol consumed and there is, a kind of entertainment value here. But fundamentally, the image there is not Buddhist. It can't be Buddhist without consecration. So one can look at the Bohemian Club's Buddha and say, well, it's not Buddhist because it's not consecrated. But I think that's partly missing the point. For the Bohemians, and this is long before the kind of Buddho-capitalist consumer culture that exploded in the second half of the 20th century down to the present, I think they were in some ways quite sincere in trying to find ways to understand their conditions of well-being, such as they were quite privileged, but also quite tantalized by other cosmologies, if you will, other formations of being. And to some extent, I think there was a genuine interest in transformation. The appropriation comes in the context, however, of a geopolitical framework of American imperialism and Euro-American imperialism related to Asia, and all sorts of sort of global capital and commerce that's beginning to build these kinds of systematic interrelationships that were very, very much about power over. The Bohemians were a product of that system, and increasingly so. So when they were borrowing quite sincerely certain forms to explore spiritual questions perhaps, or artistic, visual, aesthetic questions, they were also doing so in this critical formulation, I'm suggesting, within a system of power and a system of imperial power in particular that was backed up by military pressure upon Japan and other countries. So the appropriations here are easy to single out in their visual, formal, material ways, but they're larger frameworks. The other thing that's interesting is that their appropriations are actually rather banal. If you look across the second half of the 19th century to how European and American responses, receptions to Asian Buddhisms, and particularly Japan and its Buddhist visual material culture, are partly in collecting Buddhist sculpture, we see time and again the same kind of tropes or conventional ideas or concepts that keep coming back up and up again. So the appropriation has a history of its own kind of identity. And it's interesting to see, well, what are the concepts of Buddhism historically that have arisen through the contact of Europeans and also Japanese with Indian Buddhism or South Asian Buddhist communities? Why do certain tropes, like the big seated Buddha, for example, or the head of a Buddha, or certain aspects of Buddhist clothing and costume resonate and stay so much time and again in our appropriations, or our borrowings, or our emulations, or our respectful acknowledgments in some cases? There's certain visual material forms that are captivating and powerful as visual material things, which is a roundabout way to say that the appropriations are entangled within history, power, but also entangled into some very deep fundamental questions that take visual material forms. not just sound, not just ideational concepts, but the way that they're often expressed in statues, for example. I hope that got even close to answering your rich question. Okay, I'm being told one more question, so up there, I think.
Well, I find this all totally fascinating, and thank you for your research and for coming to Seattle to launch this lecture series for us. But can you clarify? Apparently there's no trace of this Buddha now. We're not even sure exactly where it might have been located. So was it actually, do we think it was destroyed, or did it disintegrate, or what became of it?
Thank you. Mic here? Okay, I'm going to go back to some slides here because I have a couple outtakes or extras here. So one of the best things about this project was getting, as I wrote in the blog post, is getting to go to Muir Woods. I mean, and I was even given permission to go off trail with members of the Park Service staff. And here's a photograph of a truly amazing park archaeologist, Victor Belajak, who is now overseeing the Redwood National Forest to the north. In any case, a bunch of us archaeologists, me, this weird art historian, the chief ranger, Mia Monroe of the park, tromped into the woods to see if we can find any remains of the statue, and even to locate where it was. So we took the historical photographs, and this is before we had this plan of photogrammetry and digital reconstruction, all this stuff that got stopped by the pandemic. And here's Victor walking into the area where we're looking at these trees. And in the 19th century photographs, there are trees that we can still identify today. Distinctive curve of the bark, we can locate them and so forth. This is where the drone and photogrammetry stuff could, and maybe even LiDAR could help us really figure out what's going on there. In any case, Victor is standing just probably in the center of that amphitheater before the statue. And the statue probably was in this, I think I have a, oops. I don't know where the pointer is. In any case, was probably in this area. That's probably where the statue was. So then we're like, okay, we got the location, and I'm superimposing it here just to kind of fit it in here. But what else? Is there anything in the ground? And so we poked around a little bit, and the archaeologists are all very like, oh, we really have to set out the transept. We need to measure everything. And I'm like, can't we just poke around a little bit? But yeah, we turned up a bunch of old bottles. But the problem is we don't know that these are Bohemian Club bottles because the area was used for day tripping tourist campers, overnight visits for years after the Bohemian Club. So these may not be, I mean, I think these do look like 19th century bottles, actually. But in any case, you really would need a formal archaeological project here. The other thing they did do, which inconclusive, is they took soil samples, trying to see if they could come up with evidence of plaster. And it was inconclusive, unfortunately, but we didn't know exactly where to look at that moment precisely, and you really need to do much more of a systematic kind of stratigraphic kind of excavation, which is not really something that you can do easily in a national park like this. So there's no evidence on top of the ground. There's no sort of chunks of white stuff that you could kick up. But there is some debris, there is some garbage, and some of it might be small pieces of wood that might have come from the Buddha. So the answer is nothing's there, but the imaginary kind of realm of what's underneath the ground is yet to be explored.